It was a routine flight. At least, that's what Sarah, the flight attendant, thought. As she went down the aisle, she noticed a black family seated in first class. There was a subtle restlessness among them. The father, Mr. Thomas, looked agitated, and the mother, Lena, was whispering anxiously to her children. Sarah assumed the family was upset about something small, like a delay or minor discomfort. A few minutes later, a loud argument erupted when Sarah asked Mr. Thomas to settle down. She demanded that they all leave the plane, calling security. "You're disrupting the peace," Sarah said, pointing at the family. The family, shocked and confused, reluctantly complied, but little did Sarah know, the repercussions of this action would ripple far beyond the plane. After the family was escorted off the plane, whispers buzzed in the cabin. Passengers began to murmur about the Thomas family. "Do you know who they are?" someone asked. Sarah didn't pay much attention. She was too busy fixing her uniform, feeling the irritation of having to deal with an unruly family. As the aircraft prepared to take off, the captain's voice crackled through the intercom, but instead of the usual flight announcements, the words, "Ladies and gentlemen, we regret the inconvenience, but the flight will be delayed," echoed in the cabin. Moments later, a man in a sharp suit appeared at the door, asking for Sarah by name. "You need to come with me." Sarah followed the man, her heart racing. She hadn't anticipated the intensity of the situation. After all she had done was ask the family to leave. But now it felt different. There was an urgency in the air. Outside the plane, the man introduced himself as James Turner, a senior executive at the airline. "I need to ask you a few questions about your actions with the Thomas family," he said sternly. Sarah was confused. What had she done wrong? She had merely followed protocol, or so she thought. "You don't know who they are, do you?" James asked. Sarah shook her head, unsure where this conversation was headed. She had no idea what was coming next. James led Sarah into a conference room, the tension palpable. He leaned forward, his voice quieter now. "The Thomas family owns this airline." Sarah's eyes widened. "Owns the airline?" She blinked, trying to comprehend the gravity of what she had just heard. She had kicked out the owners of the airline. How could she have been so blind? "You mean they're the owners?" Sarah stammered, barely able to wrap her mind around it. James sighed, shaking his head in disbelief. "You made a huge mistake, Sarah. The entire company is about to find out about this, and the fallout will be significant." Back on the plane, the mood had shifted. The flight attendants exchanged nervous glances as Sarah returned, looking pale and shaken. She tried to hold her composure, but the weight of the earlier revelation gnawed at her. The Thomases were not just any family. They were the backbone of the airline. As she walked down the aisle, she felt the eyes of the passengers on her. Some were still confused. Others appeared to be whispering among themselves. The captain, too, gave her a sideways glance. He, like Sarah, was now realizing the gravity of the situation. When the flight eventually took off, the air was heavy with tension. Sarah knew that when they landed, she would have to face the consequences of her actions. Little did she know, this was only the beginning of a much larger reckoning. Mr. and Mrs. Thomas were not the type to cause a scene. They were a well-respected family in the business world, known for their philanthropy and quiet power. Yet, when Sarah's actions came to light, they were furious, but not in the way Sarah had expected. Instead of a confrontation, the family chose a more strategic response. They waited until the plane landed and the media had gathered. Then, they sent out a press release. The headline was simple, but the implications were far-reaching. Racial bias leads to unjust treatment of airline owners. The media frenzy began almost immediately. News outlets scrambled to get statements, and soon, the entire country was talking about the incident. The news spread like wildfire. The media was relentless, with headlines featuring Sarah's name along with images of the Thomas family looking composed and dignified. Sarah had been a flight attendant for years, but now she found herself at the center of a storm she hadn't seen coming. Her manager called her into his office the next day. "Sarah," he said, shaking his head. "Do you know the damage this has done? The Thomas family is known nationwide. You've put us in a very difficult position." Sarah could only nod, the weight of her actions slowly sinking in. She had never considered the possibility that her actions would go viral. She had been so focused on doing her job that she had completely overlooked the human element. The Thomas family, despite their public status, had no desire for public humiliation. Instead, they had requested a private meeting with Sarah. The airline's executives arranged the meeting, hoping it would help smooth things over. When Sarah met the Thomases in the quiet, elegant boardroom, she felt small in comparison. Lena Thomas, the mother, was the first to speak. "Sarah, I know that mistakes happen, but it's important to understand that we're all human," she said calmly. "We understand what you were trying to do, but this situation could have been avoided if we had been given the chance to explain ourselves." Sarah took a deep breath, realizing that the power dynamics in this situation were more complicated than she had ever imagined. She wasn't just apologizing for her actions. She was apologizing for deep-rooted assumptions she had made about the family based on nothing but appearances. In the days following the meeting, Sarah began to reflect on the larger picture. Her personal discomfort was a small price to pay compared to the lessons she had learned about privilege, race, and bias. She spoke to her fellow flight attendants, telling them what had happened. At first, they were skeptical, but as Sarah shared her experience, they began to see how easy it was to let assumptions shape their actions. Sarah's apology, however, wasn't enough for everyone. Some passengers still sided with her. Others were quick to defend the Thomas family. But the discussions were more about self-reflection than blame. The incident had started a dialogue that couldn't be ignored. As the story of Sarah's mistake continued to make headlines, unexpected alliances began to form. Sarah's colleagues started coming to her with their own stories of bias, subtle assumptions they had made about passengers based on their appearances, class, or even the clothes they wore. They realized that the incident wasn't just about Sarah or the Thomases. It was about a larger societal issue. One afternoon, Sarah sat down with Amanda, a fellow flight attendant who had worked with her for years. "I've been thinking," Amanda said hesitantly. "You were wrong to judge them, but I think we've all been guilty of judging people based on their looks. It's not just you." Sarah nodded. "I've never thought about it that way. We always assume we know who people are just by looking at them, but we don't. And it's not just race. Sometimes it's class, gender, or even how people speak." Amanda leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "Exactly. And maybe it's time we start addressing this, not just within the airline, but in the way we approach all our passengers." The conversation marked the beginning of a small revolution among the flight crew. They didn't know exactly where it would lead, but they knew one thing for sure. They had to change. While Sarah was learning valuable lessons about empathy and bias, the public backlash against her continued to escalate. The media, while initially sympathetic, now focused on questioning the airline's role in allowing such an incident to happen. The Thomas family, however, kept their distance from the spotlight, preferring to stay out of the fray and maintain their dignity. In a particularly scathing interview, a well-known journalist criticized Sarah's actions as emblematic of a much larger issue: the ingrained racism that exists in society, especially among those in service roles. "It's one thing to ask someone to behave appropriately," the journalist stated. "It's another to assume someone is a threat simply because of the color of their skin or their status. We need to do better, especially in an industry that serves people from all walks of life." Sarah could feel the weight of these words. She had assumed her actions were justified because of the way the Thomases were behaving. Now she realized just how much of her decision had been influenced by her own biases. Despite the Thomases' attempts to maintain their privacy, the media frenzy only grew. Reporters camped outside their home, trying to get a comment from Mr. and Mrs. Thomas. The couple, instead of issuing a public statement themselves, took a different route. They arranged a private interview with a respected journalist, Liam Harris, who had always been known for his fair approach to such sensitive topics. In the interview, Lena Thomas spoke calmly but firmly. This situation is about more than just what happened on a plane. It's about a society that too often judges people based on their appearances, their race, or their social status. We are not defined by our wealth, our skin color, or the clothes we wear. We are defined by the way we treat others. Her words hit home for many, and the public response was overwhelmingly positive. People began to understand that the Thomases weren't just victims of a single incident. They were calling attention to something larger, a systemic issue of discrimination that affected many people every day. As the media storm raged on, the Thomas family sat down together to decide what to do next. Mr. Thomas, a seasoned businessman, knew that their public image was being shaped by forces beyond their control. While they had always kept their business ventures and personal lives separate, the incident had pushed them to consider their influence. "We can't just sit back and let this be about us," Mr. Thomas said, his voice low. "This is bigger than one flight. We have an opportunity here to make a real difference." Lena agreed. "We've been silent for too long on these issues. This situation has opened our eyes to the need for change. We can use this to spark a larger conversation about privilege, bias, and what it means to truly understand one another." Together, they made the decision to turn this public controversy into a platform for education and reform. They would focus not on retribution, but on creating awareness and helping people understand the broader implications of their actions. It had been a week since the incident, and Sarah's guilt had grown heavier with each passing day. She knew that the apology she had offered to the Thomases wasn't enough. She needed to do more, not just for them, but for herself, and for the broader community she served. Finally, she wrote a public apology. She addressed not only the Thomases, but also everyone who had been impacted by her actions. The letter, which was published in several news outlets, read, "I made a mistake. I allowed my assumptions to cloud my judgment, and in doing so, I caused harm to a family that did nothing wrong. I have learned that we all have biases, and that the key to overcoming them is understanding and compassion. I take full responsibility for my actions, and will work to be better, not just for the passengers I serve, but for myself and society as a whole." The response was mixed. Some people were supportive, while others criticized her for not recognizing her own privileges sooner. But one thing was clear: the conversation had shifted. People were beginning to understand the complexity of the issue. The airline, facing a backlash of its own, began to take serious action. The management had realized that the incident had exposed flaws in their internal training and policies. In response, they announced a new diversity and sensitivity training program for all employees, from ground staff to pilots. The program was designed not just to teach about racial bias, but about empathy and cultural awareness. Mr. and Mrs. Thomas were invited to collaborate with the airline in creating this training, using their own experiences and perspectives to help shape the curriculum. They saw this as a unique opportunity to make a lasting impact in the airline industry. "We don't want to just be known for our wealth or our family business," Lena Thomas said during a press conference. "We want to be known for our commitment to creating a more inclusive, fair world. We hope this will be a small step in that direction." As the airline implemented its new programs, Sarah, too, began her own journey of self-reflection. She enrolled in workshops on bias and attended community discussions about racial inequality. She even volunteered for programs aimed at helping marginalized groups gain a voice in industries that had historically excluded them. Sarah's transformation became an example for others in the airline industry. Her openness to learning, to being vulnerable and honest about her past mistakes, resonated with many of her colleagues. Soon, her efforts caught the attention of other businesses, and the Thomas family found themselves approached by multiple companies seeking their advice on diversity and inclusion. As the airline began rolling out its new diversity training programs, Sarah found herself more involved in the process than she had anticipated. She became part of the team tasked with presenting the new policies to other flight attendants, pilots, and even ground crew. Sarah wasn't just teaching about bias anymore. She was living it. Every day, she encountered moments where she had to confront her own assumptions, even if they were small. The Thomas family had been quietly involved behind the scenes, helping craft the curriculum and ensuring that it wasn't just a checklist of buzzwords, but a genuine, comprehensive approach to tackling biases in the workplace. The airline also launched a public campaign in solidarity with the Thomases, featuring their story as a testament to growth and understanding. More than just a company initiative, this effort quickly morphed into a movement. Other industries, from hospitality to retail, began reaching out to the airline to learn how they could implement similar programs. Sarah started hearing from other employees within the industry, people who had similar stories, those who had once acted out of ignorance but now wanted to make amends. Despite the progress, not everyone was supportive of the changes. A vocal minority began to push back against the airline's new direction. Some passengers, frustrated by the attention the incident had garnered, began to voice their dissatisfaction, accusing the airline of pandering to a politically correct agenda. Online forums erupted with passionate debates, and Sarah's actions, which had once seemed like an isolated mistake, became emblematic of what some saw as a larger culture war. Social media posts labeled the Thomases as self-righteous and claimed that they were exploiting the situation for personal gain. Others criticized Sarah for allowing the airline to bend to the whims of the rich family. The criticism wasn't just limited to the airline's management. There were calls to boycott the airline, and some frequent flyers canceled their memberships in protest. The pressure grew, and Sarah began to question whether the steps they had taken were worth the backlash. But amidst the noise, she reminded herself of why the changes were necessary. Lena Thomas, who had been largely silent during the media storm, finally decided to step forward and deliver a public speech. She understood that her family's silence had only fueled speculation. It was time to clarify their stance and take charge of the narrative. The speech was scheduled to take place at a national diversity and inclusion conference. As Lena stepped onto the stage, she felt the weight of the moment. The room was packed with business leaders, influencers, and activists. All eyes were on her. We are here today because of a mistake, a misunderstanding, and yes, because of an incident that went viral. But this isn't just about me or my family. It's about the systemic biases that exist in every corner of our society, often unseen, but always present. We have an opportunity now to use our platform for change, not for fame. It's about creating a world where we don't assume who someone is based on their appearance, wealth, or race. It's about listening and learning. The audience was captivated. As Lena spoke, Sarah sat among them, feeling a sense of pride in the journey they had all taken together. Lena's words were a turning point, not just for the Thomas family, but for all the companies and individuals who had started to reevaluate their own practices. While the Thomas family worked tirelessly to push the message of inclusivity, Sarah began facing a personal conflict. She was learning and growing, but she was also haunted by guilt. The more she worked on herself, the more she realized how deeply ingrained her biases had been, how easy it had been to dismiss the Thomases as troublemakers based on a hat and the color of their skin. It wasn't just a matter of apologizing anymore. It was about unlearning years of assumptions, and sometimes that process felt like it might never end. The guilt weighed on her, making her second-guess even her most well-intentioned actions. One evening, after a long day of training sessions, Sarah went for a walk in the park to clear her head. As she sat on a bench, reflecting on everything, she received a message from Lena Thomas. It was short and simple. "You're doing great. Don't let the noise cloud your progress. Keep pushing forward." Sarah smiled, feeling a small sense of relief. Maybe this journey wasn't about being perfect. It was about progress, not perfection. The media's attention started to die down, but the consequences of the incident were still felt within the airline. The new policies had not only started to impact employee behavior, but also shifted the company culture significantly. Employees were more aware of their biases, and there was a tangible effort to make the workplace more inclusive and respectful. Sarah, for her part, had become a beacon of change within the airline. She wasn't just a flight attendant anymore. She was a mentor, guiding her fellow crew members through the nuances of cultural competency and empathy. Sarah had made mistakes, but she was determined to make a difference. A month later, Sarah received an unexpected call from James Turner, a senior executive at the airline. "Sarah, I just wanted to let you know that you've been nominated for a company award for the progress you've made in promoting inclusivity within the crew. It's clear that you've embraced change, and others have noticed." The recognition felt like a full-circle moment for Sarah. She had gone from being a symbol of bias to becoming an advocate for understanding and inclusivity. It wasn't just about fixing what she had broken. It was about rebuilding, brick by brick. Months passed, and the story of the Thomas family continued to inspire those who heard it. The airline had transformed, not because of a public relations stunt, but because of genuine, heartfelt efforts to change. The Thomases weren't interested in vengeance. They were interested in progress. They used their position of power to create initiatives in the community, funding programs that focused on youth development, particularly for young people of color who were interested in aviation. The Thomas Foundation partnered with schools, providing scholarships and mentorship opportunities for students who might not have had the means to pursue careers in aviation or business. For Lena and Mr. Thomas, the journey had come full circle. They had turned a negative incident into an opportunity to give back and create lasting change. They were more than just business owners. They were change makers, and their legacy was beginning to unfold in ways they hadn't imagined. One afternoon, as Sarah stood by the plane's entrance, preparing to greet passengers, she saw a familiar face walk through the gate. It was Lena Thomas, smiling warmly as she approached. Sarah had been waiting for this moment, the chance to thank Lena personally for all the guidance she had received. As Lena reached her, Sarah hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Lena, I can't thank you enough for everything you've done, for the patience you've shown me and for helping me see the bigger picture. I don't think I'll ever fully be able to make up for the harm I caused, but I promise you, I will keep learning and changing." Lena smiled softly. "Sarah, you've already done more than most people would. You've shown growth. That's all we can ask for. Keep going, and let the change continue." As Sarah watched Lena walk down the aisle, she realized that the journey was never truly over. It was a journey of constant learning, self-reflection, and growth. And for the first time in a long while, Sarah was excited to keep moving forward. Months after the launch of the diversity training programs, the airline had become a case study for other businesses looking to tackle issues of inclusivity and bias. The transformation was evident, not just in the policies, but in the culture of the company. Employee satisfaction had risen, and passengers began to feel the difference as well. There was a new sense of community aboard every flight. Flight attendants, pilots, and ground staff no longer saw each other as mere colleagues, but as teammates working together to create a respectful, welcoming environment. Sarah was at the heart of this change. Her commitment to learning and growing had earned her the respect of not only her peers, but also her superiors. She had gone from being a symbol of mistaken judgment to becoming one of the airline's most valued diversity advocates. It was clear that Sarah had turned her past mistakes into a powerful force for positive change. Her relationship with the Thomas family had also evolved. What started as a moment of tension and misunderstanding had blossomed into a lasting partnership. Lena and Mr. Thomas had become mentors to Sarah, and they often met to discuss their shared vision for the future of business and society. The Thomases also began hosting community outreach events, partnering with the airline to support causes they believed in: education, economic empowerment, and civil rights. They were committed to ensuring that their legacy was more than just about their wealth or success. They wanted to be remembered for their contributions to justice and equality, for using their platform to make the world a better place. Despite the progress, Sarah continued to encounter challenges. She was no longer just working as a flight attendant. She had taken on a role as a diversity coach, helping her colleagues navigate difficult conversations around race, bias, and privilege. Some days were easier than others, but Sarah was determined. One day, during a team meeting, a new flight attendant asked her, "Sarah, how do you stay so patient? How do you keep your calm in the face of all these tough situations?" Sarah thought for a moment. "It's not easy. There are days when I feel overwhelmed by the weight of everything. But I keep reminding myself that this journey isn't just about me. It's about all of us. We're all in this together, trying to make the world a little better, one conversation at a time." Her words resonated with the team. Sarah had learned to be vulnerable and open about her own mistakes, and it had made her a more compassionate leader. She was no longer afraid of confronting her own flaws or biases. In fact, she had come to view each challenge as an opportunity to grow. That night, Sarah reflected on how far she had come. She thought about the Thomases, their strength, their grace, and the example they had set for her. They had turned an uncomfortable situation into a catalyst for transformation, not just for the airline, but for herself. And though she knew there was still much work to be done, Sarah felt a sense of hope and purpose she had never experienced before. As the airline continued its mission of inclusivity, a defining moment occurred when a major corporate partner invited the airline's leadership to give a keynote address at a prestigious business summit. The Thomas family was asked to join, and they agreed, seeing it as another opportunity to push their message of inclusivity and progress. Lena and Mr. Thomas were eager to speak about the importance of corporate responsibility in fostering social change, but it was Sarah who would speak about the personal aspect of transformation. She had become a living example of the power of redemption. Standing before an audience of industry leaders, Sarah shared her story. "I was wrong, and I had to admit that. But the more I leaned into that discomfort, the more I realized it wasn't just about me making amends. It was about creating a lasting impact. We have to be willing to face our flaws and our biases head on. It's uncomfortable, but it's the only way forward, and it's never too late to change." Her words struck a chord with the audience. Several leaders, moved by her transparency and honesty, reached out afterward, asking how they could implement similar changes within their own organizations. The ripple effect had begun. As time passed, Sarah and the Thomas family's efforts began to bear fruit in unexpected ways. Young professionals, inspired by the changes they had seen, began seeking out careers that emphasized values of equity, inclusivity, and integrity. Many of these new recruits chose to work for the airline, believing in its newfound commitment to justice and fairness. Sarah, now a senior trainer and advocate for change, was invited to speak at universities, where she taught students about the importance of unconscious bias, cultural sensitivity, and leadership through humility. The airline also launched a scholarship program aimed at diversifying the aviation industry, with a special focus on providing opportunities for minority students. Meanwhile, the Thomas Foundation had grown into a powerful entity, working not just in aviation, but in other sectors, supporting initiatives that promoted racial equity, economic mobility, and civil rights. They had become not just a family of business moguls, but community leaders, dedicated to bringing about real, systemic change. Though much had been achieved, Sarah, Lena, and Mr. Thomas knew that the road ahead was long. Institutional change takes time, and the work they were doing would have to be continued by future generations. But the foundation had been laid, and the culture of inclusivity that they had fought for was becoming ingrained in not just their company, but in the broader community. One evening, Sarah and Lena sat together at a quiet cafe, reflecting on how far they had come. "I think we're doing it, Lena. We're actually making a difference," Sarah said, her voice filled with quiet pride. Lena smiled. "We're just getting started. The real work begins now, making sure this change continues, that it goes beyond us, beyond this airline, and touches everyone." Sarah nodded, understanding the truth of Lena's words. There would always be more work to do, more people to educate, and more assumptions to challenge. but for the first time, she felt hopeful about the future. Years later, the story of Sarah and the Thomases became a textbook example of how even the smallest actions could have profound, far-reaching consequences. The airline continued to thrive, not just because of its innovative business practices, but because it had become a leader in corporate social responsibility. Its focus on inclusivity and diversity had earned it respect across industries. Sarah had moved up the ranks within the company, but she never lost sight of the reason she started this journey: to create an environment where everyone felt heard and respected. Her legacy, like the Thomases, was rooted in the belief that true progress requires not just policy changes, but deep personal transformation. And as the airline hosted its annual diversity summit, Sarah found herself once again on stage, now as a speaker in her own right, encouraging the next generation to continue the work that had changed her life. The final chapter of the story came at the 10-year anniversary celebration of the incident that had changed everything. The Thomases and Sarah, along with key members of the airline, gathered to mark the occasion with a ceremony that honored not just their accomplishments, but also the lessons learned along the way. Lena Thomas spoke first, her voice steady and full of conviction. "We started this journey with one goal in mind: to prove that we are all capable of growth, change, and redemption. We must continue to push forward and not let the challenges discourage us." Sarah followed, looking out at the audience. "This journey has been the hardest thing I've ever done, but it's also been the most rewarding. If we can learn to confront our own biases, listen to others, and treat people with respect, we can truly make the world a better place." As they stood together on stage, the audience erupted into applause. The legacy they had built, of change, understanding, and inclusivity, was now permanent, woven into the fabric of the airline, the community, and the world they had impacted. Even with their newfound success, Sarah, Lena, and Mr. Thomas were not immune to the challenges that came with being at the forefront of change. The airline's success in promoting inclusivity had drawn attention, but not always the right kind. As the years passed, competitors within the airline industry began to adopt similar policies, claiming they were inspired by the success of Sarah's airline. While this imitation was flattering, it also posed a threat. The Thomases and Sarah knew they could not rest on their laurels. They had set a precedent, but now the challenge was ensuring that their efforts remained genuine and not just superficial corporate maneuvers. One day, during a meeting with Lena, Sarah voiced her concerns. "How do we keep pushing forward when everyone else starts copying what we've done?" she asked. Lena leaned back, her eyes focused on the bigger picture. "We've created a culture. No one can copy that. It's about the people, the lives we're touching, and the difference we're making in the world. Let's not worry about the competition. Let's keep being authentic, and the world will recognize us for who we are." Her words resonated with Sarah. Authenticity, not imitation, would be their continued driving force. They had already laid the foundation. Now, they just needed to ensure their company's culture was sustainable and that their message of true inclusion was never diluted. To take their work to the next level, the Thomas Foundation expanded its reach beyond aviation. The foundation's efforts began focusing on tech innovation and environmental sustainability, areas where diversity had traditionally been underrepresented. The Thomases believed that the next wave of growth for their family legacy lay in making sure future generations of leaders came from all backgrounds, particularly in fields that shaped the future of the planet. Sarah, now part of the Foundation's executive team, helped steer projects that provided grants and training for women and minorities entering the tech industry. It was a daunting challenge, creating spaces where young people from underrepresented backgrounds could thrive in an industry that was still largely dominated by traditional power structures. "I think we need to give them access to training, access to mentors, access to resources," Sarah said during a board meeting. "We can't just talk about equality, we need to build the pipeline." Lena nodded, her eyes lighting up with excitement. "Exactly. We're not just advocating for change, we're building the infrastructure that will make it happen." The foundation's commitment to tech and sustainability began to change the landscape of corporate social responsibility, making diversity and inclusion an essential component of every new project. The Thomases weren't just giving back, they were investing in the next generation of entrepreneurs, leaders, and innovators. One day, as Sarah sat at her desk, reviewing reports on the Foundation's new initiatives, her phone buzzed with an unexpected call. It was from Emily Turner, the airline's original CEO, the very same person who had helped Sarah through her early stages of professional development. Sarah hadn't heard from her in years. "Sarah, I need to talk to you. It's important." Emily's voice was tinged with urgency. Without hesitation, Sarah agreed to meet with Emily at a nearby cafe. Emily arrived, looking a bit more worn than Sarah remembered, but still sharp. She quickly got to the point. "The airline is facing a major crisis. We're being sued by a large corporate rival for anti-competitive behavior related to our diversity initiatives. They claim we have an unfair advantage because we prioritize inclusivity over profit in our business decisions. This could unravel everything we've built." Sarah's heart sank. It was hard to believe that something as seemingly positive as their work could be twisted into an accusation of corporate malpractice. But as Emily spoke, it became clear that the issue wasn't about the airline's practices. It was about the threat they posed to competitors who weren't willing to invest in real change. "We need your help. The Thomases have the influence, but we need someone who understands both the corporate world and the cultural shifts we've been navigating. You're the perfect bridge." The lawsuit threatened not only the future of the airline, but also the values the Thomases had fought so hard to instill. The court battle was intense. The opposition had deep pockets and an army of legal experts who argued that the airline's diversity efforts amounted to preferential treatment and that it unfairly impacted other businesses in the industry. Sarah found herself at the heart of the battle. She spent hours consulting with Lena and Mr. Thomas, strategizing on how to defend their approach without compromising their principles. As much as they had achieved, they now had to protect their vision, a vision where businesses were accountable not just to profits, but to the social well-being of the communities they served. "We can't back down now," Lena said firmly. "This isn't just about our company. It's about making sure the progress we've made doesn't disappear in the face of resistance. If we lose this, we lose everything." The public relations war intensified. Opponents began running smear campaigns, calling the airline a social experiment gone wrong, while supporters rallied, praising the Thomases for their courage and leadership. The media's coverage was divisive, but Sarah remained steadfast. She took every opportunity to speak about the long-term benefits of a truly inclusive workplace, how diversity wasn't a threat to profits, but an investment in creativity, growth, and societal well-being. After months of grueling legal battles and media scrutiny, the tide began to turn in favor of the Thomases and their airline. The key moment came when Lena Thomas took the stand. She spoke not only about the ethical reasons behind their diversity initiatives, but about the human side of the story, the real lives that had been impacted by their efforts. It's easy to look at this as a business decision, but for us, it's personal. We've seen firsthand the difference a supportive, inclusive environment can make for people. People like Sarah, people like the employees and families we've helped. It's about giving everyone a chance to thrive. If that's wrong, then we're happy to be wrong. Lena's impassioned speech shifted the tide in their favor. The jury, moved by her words, began to understand that the case wasn't about unfair competition, but about creating spaces of equal opportunity. In the end, the airline won the lawsuit, and the Thomases' legacy remained intact. With the legal battle behind them, the Thomases and Sarah could finally focus on what mattered most, continuing to push forward their vision for a more inclusive world. The court victory sent a powerful message to the business community. Inclusive practices weren't just the right thing to do, they were profitable and necessary. Lena and Mr. Thomas decided to expand their influence even further. They announced plans to create a nationwide network of companies committed to integrating diversity into their operations. Through partnerships with businesses in different industries, they would offer consulting, training, and resources to help others build similar cultures. Sarah, who had once been unsure of her role in this journey, found herself at the center of these new projects, working to scale the diversity programs she had helped create. The work was demanding, but it was fulfilling in ways she couldn't have imagined before. The entire journey had become more than just a career. It had become her life's mission. Years later, Sarah stood once again at the annual Diversity Summit where it all began. This time, however, it wasn't just about the Thomases or the airline. It was about the larger movement they had helped create. People from all walks of life, from CEOs to community leaders, gathered to discuss how they too could contribute to the global effort for social and corporate change. Sarah looked out at the crowd and felt a profound sense of fulfillment. The work wasn't over. The battles were still being fought. But she knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the impact they had started had created ripples that would continue to spread. She smiled, thinking of Lena and Mr. Thomas. They had shown her that change was possible, if you were willing to confront the uncomfortable truths and fight for what was right. And with that, Sarah knew that the legacy of the Thomas family and the movement they had ignited would live on for generations to come. The success of the airline's diversity programs began to spark a nationwide movement. What had once been seen as an industry-specific shift now spread across corporate America, influencing businesses of all sizes and industries to adopt diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. The Thomases and Sarah became symbols of change, proof that inclusivity was not just an ideal, but a strategic necessity for business growth. It was an exciting time for Sarah. As the head of diversity training for the Thomas Foundation, she traveled frequently, meeting with executives from tech companies, law firms, and even governmental organizations, all eager to learn how to implement inclusive practices. Her influence reached beyond the airline sector and began shaping public policy as well, with lawmakers seeking her expertise on how to legislate diversity in the workplace. Despite all the recognition and progress, Sarah found herself wrestling with a question. Had they really achieved true change, or was it just a corporate trend that would eventually fizzle out? She often asked herself if she was truly making a difference, or if the movement had become too much about accolades and optics. It was a question that gnawed at her, especially as she saw new barriers and challenges emerge, disguised in more sophisticated forms. While Sarah continued her work with the foundation, the Thomases were busy expanding their outreach beyond just corporate partnerships. They launched community programs aimed at empowering underrepresented youth, particularly in urban centers. These programs focused on mentoring, job training, and leadership development for young people of color, helping them enter fields like technology, finance, and media, industries that had long been closed off to them. However, the challenges of scaling such initiatives were immense. The Thomases quickly learned that transforming the corporate landscape was one thing, but changing the cultural fabric of society was far more complex. Many communities still faced systemic inequalities that couldn't be addressed by business initiatives alone. Sarah began to feel the weight of these challenges. Despite their best efforts, the gap in opportunities between privileged communities and marginalized communities remained vast. For every success story they could point to, there were still many individuals left behind. She could feel the pressure building. It wasn't enough to just change the workplace. They needed to change the system itself. One evening, Sarah received a letter from her estranged mother, someone she hadn't spoken to since before the airline's diversity movement began. Her mother, who had been critical of Sarah's involvement in what she had seen as radical social change, now wrote, admitting her own realization about how important the work Sarah was doing truly was. The letter was filled with regret, but also with a plea for understanding. "I see now how much good you're doing, and I wish I had supported you sooner. Your work is more important than I ever understood. I hope we can reconnect." The letter stirred something deep within Sarah. Family was still one of the most complicated areas of her life. She had spent so much time building professional relationships and leading large-scale change that she had neglected her own roots. Now, as she reflected on everything she had learned, Sarah felt torn. Her commitment to the cause had alienated her from those closest to her. She called her mother. The conversation was emotional and raw, full of unspoken apologies and painful acknowledgments of the past. But in that moment, Sarah realized that the path to personal healing was just as important as the path to societal transformation. She agreed to meet with her mother the next weekend, an important step in mending a relationship that had been broken for far too long. As the movement continued to grow, Sarah began to notice pushback from some of the very corporations that had initially embraced diversity programs. Some executives, faced with economic downturns or shifting markets, began to cut back on diversity initiatives, citing them as non-essential in the wake of other business priorities. This concerned Sarah deeply. She had always known that sustainability and diversity efforts required a long-term commitment, but the reality of corporate profitability pressures was a sobering reminder that true change could not be guaranteed by policy alone. Companies were willing to invest in diversity when it was trendy, but would they continue when the financial winds changed? She brought this issue to Lena and Mr. Thomas during a foundation board meeting. We've got to make sure the principles of diversity aren't just nice-to-have features. They're not just something we do for PR. We need to make them integral to every business function, she urged. Lena nodded, understanding the weight of the issue. We've built something big, Sarah. But sustainability means we need to institutionalize these values, make them core to everything we do. That way, they can't be cut when times get tough. While Sarah and Lena fought to ensure that their corporate partnerships remained strong, the real work, Sarah realized, was far from done. The ultimate goal of their efforts was not just to change individual companies, but to reshape the cultural mindset on a broad scale. True inclusivity needed to go beyond the boardroom. It had to be embedded into every aspect of life. The Thomas Foundation launched a series of public awareness campaigns aimed at changing public perceptions about race, privilege, and inclusion. They began collaborating with educators, artists, and activists, focusing on using storytelling and art to promote empathy and understanding. Sarah found herself working on these projects more than ever, attending rallies and speaking at schools, sharing her own story as an example of personal transformation. But as she spoke with people from various walks of life, Sarah encountered an unsettling realization. Real change was going to require something much deeper than just shifting policies or making diversity a business priority. It required a cultural shift, a change in hearts and minds. The generational divide in attitudes about race, privilege, and equality was stark, and Sarah knew it would take time, perhaps years or even decades, to fully break down the barriers that had been built over centuries. As Sarah continued her work with the Thomas Foundation, the family legacy began to evolve. Lena and Mr. Thomas, now older and wiser, found themselves transitioning out of the day-to-day leadership of the foundation, passing the torch to Sarah and a new generation of leaders within the organization. One evening, as they sat together discussing the future, Lena shared a thought that had been on her mind. When we started this journey, I never imagined it would grow into something like this. I've always believed that change comes from within, but I've seen how much our work has impacted the world beyond us. I'm proud of what we've accomplished, but I know the hardest work is still ahead. Sarah nodded. I'm ready, and I know we're not doing it alone. This movement is bigger than any of us. As they looked to the future, the Thomases knew that the true measure of their success would not just be in how much they had changed the corporate world, but in how much they had touched individual lives, how they had inspired others to take up the mantle and continue the work for future generations. Years into their journey, the impact of the diversity initiatives began to extend internationally. As Sarah continued her advocacy work, she was invited to consult on global diversity initiatives, helping multinational corporations in Europe, Asia, and Africa implement similar models of inclusion. It was a humbling experience for Sarah to see how their local efforts had ignited global conversations on race, gender, and equality. But with this global expansion came new challenges. Each culture, each region, had its own unique struggles with inclusivity. Sarah found herself learning as much from her international colleagues as they learned from her. These new partnerships sparked new ideas, and the movement started to take on global dimensions, eventually evolving into a collaborative effort that went beyond business. It became a worldwide movement for justice and equality. The sun was setting over the city as Sarah stood by the window in the Thomas Foundation's headquarters. It had been years since she first joined the cause, a young woman unsure of her place in the world, unsure of the magnitude of the change she could make. But now, as she watched the sun dip behind the horizon, Sarah understood that everything had come full circle. The movement was no longer just a corporate initiative. It was a global revolution. Sarah thought back to the early days, when she and Lena first navigated the precarious waters of changing the culture within the airline. The challenges, the setbacks, the skepticism from people who doubted their efforts, those were all part of the journey. They had fought for inclusivity, for the belief that everyone deserved an equal shot, no matter their background, race, or gender. Today, that message had resonated across borders, transcending industries and cultures. But perhaps the most profound change wasn't just in the corporate world. It was in the hearts of individuals, in the stories of employees who had found their voice, of children who were now dreaming bigger because they saw themselves in leadership roles, of entire communities that were now empowered to take control of their futures. "We did it, didn't we?" Sarah said softly, turning toward Lena, who had joined her at the window. There was a quiet smile on Lena's face as she looked out over the city too. They were both silent for a moment, reflecting on the incredible journey. "Yes, we did. And it's just the beginning." Lena's voice was calm but firm. She had always been the visionary, and she knew that the work they'd started would continue long after they were gone. The world had changed, but the fight for equality and justice would always be ongoing. They had built a foundation for the future, one where diversity wasn't a trend or a checkbox. It was a way of life. In the years to come, Sarah would pass the torch to the next generation of leaders within the foundation, just as Lena and Mr. Thomas had done for her. But one thing would remain the same: the core belief that change didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened through collaboration, through hard work, and through the belief that when people come together to do what's right, nothing is impossible. As the evening grew darker, Sarah turned away from the window and looked at the wall lined with photographs, the faces of the thousands of people who had been impacted by their work. There were employees, families, children, mentors, and activists, each one representing a piece of the puzzle they had all worked to complete. The world was still imperfect. There was still much work to be done, but Sarah knew in her heart that the foundation they had laid was strong. It would carry on, not just through them, but through the countless lives that had been touched by their efforts. In that moment, Sarah understood that their movement had become more than just a business success. It had become a legacy.